Is President Donald Trump preparing to wash his hands of Ukraine peace negotiations? Recent comments from the White House could be interpreted as the foundations of a US off-ramp. Can Ukraine really reclaim its lost territory? And if so, does that mean Europe should prepare for a longer-term conflict? You're watching Counterpoints with me, Melinda Nusafora. From holding no cards to potentially winning them all back, President Trump has revised his position on the Russia-Ukraine war again. From this in February.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's exactly
Remember
what
this.
you're doing.
You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel.
To this in September.
Well, the biggest progress is that the Russian economy is terrible right now. It's, as you know, it's crashing. And that, frankly, Ukraine is doing a very good job of stopping this very large army.
The president even suggested Ukraine could retake its lost territory. But to do so, Kiev would need more help from Europe. Instead of a quick end, is the president now suggesting a more drawn-out war? Poland's Prime Minister Donald Tusk is sceptical of the president's views, warning that behind Trump's surprising optimism was a promise to reduce US involvement and shift responsibility for ending the war to Europe. Adding to that burden are accusations Russia is provocatively breaching NATO airspace in an effort to test the alliance's response. Earlier this month, Russian drones and fighter jets flew over 3 European countries 3 times in just 2 weeks. On this episode of Counterpoints, we'll ask, is President Trump building an off-ramp for the US-led peace negotiations? If Ukraine can really win back its lost territory? And is Russia testing NATO resolve with airspace violations? Well, joining us to discuss the latest developments is General Sir Richard Sheriff, a former Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO forces. Brandon Weichert is here, Senior National Security Editor at The National Interest and author of A Disaster of Our Own Making, How the West Lost Ukraine. And rounding out our panel, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Alexander Mereshko, a Ukrainian MP from President Zelensky's Servant of the People Party and Chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us here on Counterpoints. Well, the US president has gone from accusing the Ukrainian leader of being a dictator who doesn't hold any cards to being a brave man who's putting up one hell of a fight, to quote the president. So when President Trump said he thinks Ukraine could retake lost territory, was he spelling the end of US attempts to quickly resolve the war? On top of that, he's contemplating allowing Ukraine to buy Tomahawk long-range missiles capable of hitting Moscow. So let me start with you, General Sheriff. Is President Trump about to wash his hands of US-led peace negotiations?
Well, clearly I'm not in Trump's mind, but given the way he has effectively, in many ways, acquiesced with Putin, tried to force what I call a capitulation deal down the throat of the Ukrainians and President Zelenskyy, and the fact that, yes, he may be talking, he may say that Ukraine can recapture its lost territories, but he's not accompanying that with any clear statement of US and indeed NATO support to Ukraine to allow it to do so. So I think the deduction must be that, yes, he is about to wash his hands and hand it off to Europe and Ukraine.
Dr. Mereshkov, what do you think about that? I mean, when you hear an analysis that perhaps the US is building itself an off-ramp, how does that, is that perceived in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I'm absolutely confident that President Trump will not withdraw from the process of negotiations for a very simple reason, because President Trump is a very serious politician. He prides himself on being a master of deal making. And we know that to make a deal, first of all, you need to keep your word. If you made a promise, you should follow through on this promise. President Trump has already made this promise. He made a suggestion, a ceasefire offer. Ukraine has agreed to this offer. We have agreed also to make a minerals deal with the United States. So I'm sure that President Trump, as a serious, respectable, credible politician, will keep his word.
Brandon, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think that the general is correct that we are creating, or Trump is creating, an off-ramp for the United States. I don't believe, though, that this is really something to really hang one's hat on if you are gung-ho about continuing the war. By handing it over to Europe and the Ukrainians, basically Trump is sort of saying, tag, you're it now. And I understand that he's made certain commitments verbally that he will continue to supply weapons, and he's waxing eloquent publicly about, selling Tomahawks. But the realities are, and you've heard me say this before, and forgive me for sounding repetitious here, but the fact of the matter is our industrial base cannot accommodate any more demand. Right now, we're on every 4 and 8 year replenishment cycles of about 12 key weapons. That's according to a recent Wall Street Journal report. That has not changed since the beginning of the Ukraine war. And now there's more demand for U.S. weapons in the Middle East, the South American front, and whatever's going to happen with the Indo-Pacific. So I do believe Trump is creating an off-ramp, but I don't believe this is a good thing necessarily if you're hoping to see Ukraine and NATO win the day. I think he's going to leave it to the Europeans and cut his losses, because this is a mosh pit right now in Europe between Russia and Ukraine. Neither side seems able to come to a consensus. Trump doesn't want to be stuck in the middle of that.
General, what do you think? I mean, we saw in that tweet from President, on his Truth Social, saying, good luck to all. It almost, sounded like what Brandon was saying. He's saying, tag, you're it, Europe, now it's over to you. Is Trump trying to shift blame for any potential failures onto Europe now?
I think he is. Yeah, I think he is. And now, frankly, is the moment. I mean, I said now is the moment. The moment came in February after the Munich Security Conference. Now, I mean, if Europe doesn't wake up now, then absolutely nothing's going to happen, because it's now up to Europe to put together a properly thought through strategy, military, financial, and economic, to give Ukraine the support it needs to achieve the defeat of Russia, without which there will not be a lasting ceasefire.
Isn't that a little bit too little too late now? I mean, with more than 3 years into this conflict, has Europe really dropped the ball? And now Trump is saying, well, it's over to you, Europe, good luck to all. But Europe doesn't seem at all prepared.
Yeah, Linda, you're absolutely right. It is too late, in the sense that Europe should have done this NATO should have done this right at the very start, on the 23rd of February 2022, when immediately after the invasion. And actually, I would go back. I would say that Europe should have stepped up to the mark when the war started in February, March 2014, with the invasion of Crimea. But it's never too late on these occasions. And if Europe got its act together now, Europe could do it. But it requires political will, it requires moral courage from Europe's leadership, and it requires European populations to make real sacrifice, which they've not done. They haven't begun to make any sacrifice. Compare the sacrifice Ukraine is making for European freedom and the fact that Europe just blathers on regardless, without really digging deep.
Dr. Mareshko, what do you... The point that Brandon made about the fact that the US just simply doesn't have any more capacity to continue to provide Ukraine with the support it needs, what do you make of that? Do you think that that's true, or do you think that that's a way that the president is going to try and relinquish some of his responsibility as a NATO partner here?
Well, first of all, I believe in capabilities of the United States. It's the biggest economy in the world. It's the most powerful in military terms country in the world. So I believe in their capabilities. They have enough capacity. To say that they don't have capacity to help Ukraine to fight Russian aggression, it would be too defeatist. So I believe that the United States have enough resources to continue to help us. We should remember that we are waging this war not only for our territorial integrity, we are waging the war against a coalition or an axis of evil, including not only Russia, but also China. They act in unison, they coordinate their efforts. And Russia is waging war not only against Ukraine. Putin and his propaganda are openly state that they're waging the war against NATO, against the West, against rules-based order with the American leadership. So to support Ukraine, it's not only about European security issue, it's also about direct American national interest and American security issue.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, in my argument, the rules-based order, as we understand it, is gone. There's a meeting between Hegseth, Secretary of War, and now President Trump will be joining in Quantico, Virginia tomorrow, between 800 of our flag officers. I have been told by numerous sources involved that this is in relation to Elbridge Colby's new national strategy document, in which it outlines for the United States a new grand strategy of deprioritizing Europe, the Mideast, and Indo-Pacific and Africa, and reprioritizing, elevating the importance of Northern Command and Southern Command. This is why you see this buildup off the coast of Venezuela, for instance. Furthermore, I have been told that there's going to be talk regarding the Unified Command Policy, UCP, which was basically written in May of this year, in which Hegseth basically said we're going to reorganize the commands of the U.S. There's talk about merging EUCOM with AFRICOM. There's talk about merging NORTHCOM with SOUTHCOM. So what this means, in my opinion, if you pair what I'm hearing with what is going on in Ukraine, the tag you're it sort of thing going on between Trump and Europe, to me, it does look like we are stepping back and we will not be continuing. And I would just add on, in terms of capacity, I don't think people overseas realize how broken America's defense industrial base is, especially with all these crises now pulling on it. We do not have the kind of latent industrial capacity we enjoyed in World War II. Ironically, it's China that has that kind of capacity right now. So this is a big problem, not just for the U.S., but all of our allies who are depending on us.
Is that troubling to hear, Dr. Mereshko?
Well, it's not troubling to hear because, first of all, yes, there are people like Elbridge Colby. I read his book, The Strategy of Denial, but he doesn't make U.S. foreign policy. There are different voices in the Mr. Trump's entourage. There are people like Mr. Colby who are in favor of Asia first and so on. Yeah, let's focus on containment of China. But there are also other voices like Mr. Kellogg, like State Secretary Rubio, for example, who are more realistic about what's going on in the world and who understand the strategic importance of Ukraine and Europe for American security. And I more rely on these people.
I think that would be a mistake.
General, what do you think?
The 20th century demonstrated 3 times that Europe's security is America's security. The First World War, the Second World War, and then subsequently, of course, the Cold War. And I'm with, I think it would be from a global perspective, and I think America's perspective and certainly Europe's perspective, if America withdraws again into isolation as it did in the 1920s,
it's not isolation.
I'm afraid the future is very gloomy.
It's not isolation. There is a reorganization of the world occurring, whether we like it or not. And I think what I am hearing, at least, and again, we'll see what happens, but what I am hearing from certain people close to the president is that this is just a realistic recognition of a new tripolar world, at least between the U.S., China, and Russia. The rules-based order that dominated from 1945 to maybe 2003, I would argue it died when we went into Iraq. That is pretty much gone now, and there's a new reorganization organization underway. And I think that what you're seeing with this Ukraine thing is the kind of quiet recognition by Trump that I got to back away from this because it's going to suck me in even more. And the president does not want to be sucked in anymore to the European front.
Well, if that's the case, I go back to my point about Europe stepping up to the mark, and this is yet another wake-up call for Europe. I mean, NATO should have started the process of Europeanizing itself, because it was quite clear after the Munich Security Conference that America was not in the game as an effective NATO ally. And we saw 3 weeks ago when Poland was attacked by drones, Trump wrote it off as an accident. This was an attack on a NATO.
I would just like to say real quickly, I'm
state.
sorry, I have to correct you. We've been the most effective NATO ally since the entire formation of NATO. So in my opinion, we've given much more to NATO than anybody else. So I would say that we've been a very effective ally. None of our other partners have really, except for maybe like Poland and some of these handful of other countries, but none of these other countries in Europe, for the most part, as you rightly note, have stepped up to the plate. And I suspect they won't be either, because they don't have the capacity right now to hit the Russians the way they're talking about hitting them.
America walking away from NATO, and let's be clear, America was the absolute underpinning of the alliance for 70 years. The reason the alliance has been so successful is because of the total certainty that whatever president was in the White House, America would, no ifs, no buts, come to the aid of a NATO member if attacked. And of course, in terms of burden sharing, America paid the bills for the alliance. And so Europe has got to wake up to the fact that much of this is down to Europe, that Europe has really got to dig deep. And Europe, yes, of course, it's going to be a major capacity issue for Europe. But that's why I say Europe has to be prepared to make the sacrifices in order to step up to the mark and fill the gap. It's not going to happen overnight, but if it was prepared to do so, Europe could do so. Europe, if it came together with 14 times the GDP of Russia, 4 times the population, has got the capability to be a superpower, but it needs to come together and deliver the goods.
Brandon, I mean, do you think that European security is America's security? It sounds like you're saying that Europe's problem is no longer America's problem.
What I'm saying is what I would advocate for, and it sounds like what the Trump administration is at least leaning toward doing, and again, we'll see, is a deprioritization of Europe, not abandoning Europe completely. We're not talking about ending NATO. We're talking about stepping back in terms of being the primary guarantor of security. We are not going to do it anymore, especially when you look at the combined GDP of these European countries. They have the ability and they have the technology base to stand up on their own and start taking the lead on their own defense. Look, they're the ones who are right next door to Russia. And for 30 years, they kind of ignored this potential threat. And now the threat is here. America, unfortunately, is not in a good place right now. Our economy is still rehabilitating. We are, again, our industrial base is depleted, and we are trying drastically to reform it. But ultimately, it's not a question of even what we would want. It's a question of what can we do, and we're hitting the very serious limits on what we can do. And until we can reform our industrial base so that we can cut down on those, 4 and 8 year replenishment cycles, which is unacceptable. But until we can do that and get it to maybe 6 months to a year replenishment cycle, there's going to be no help really relied upon by the United States, no matter what the president says he wants or doesn't want to do.
Dr. Mereshko, I want to ask you this with regards to the reports that the president is assessing whether or not to provide Tomahawk long-range missiles to Ukraine via Europe. Do you think that could be a game changer? Would it pressure Moscow to negotiate a deal? Or do you think it's not going to have too much of a difference?
I don't believe in a kind of silver bullet or a game changer. Of course, we need Tomahawks. Well, we also need other kinds of sophisticated contemporary American weaponry, like, for example, Patriot systems to defend our cities and civilian population and so on. But I don't believe that any particular kind of weaponry can be a game changer. I more believe in consistent efforts, all encompassing, including all kinds of pressure put on Russia, including secondary sanctions, including political, diplomatic isolation of Russia, including all kinds of military support from our European and American allies. Only together we can stop Russian aggression. But of course, it would be a welcome gesture from our American allies to give us Tomahawks. It will increase our chances to completely defeat Russia, because Russia was already strategically defeated. But we need, as Churchill once put it, asking President Roosevelt, he said, give us the tools, we will finish the job. We can finish the job, but give us the tools.
General, do you think that these long-range missiles, say a Tomahawk, could force Russia to rethink its intransigence with regards to negotiations?
I think they'd be part of the mix. I'm with Dr. Bereshko here. That I come back to my point about the need for an overarching strategy with a clear vision and goal, being a Europe whole, free and secure from Russian aggression, Ukraine as part of it, as part of NATO. And to achieve that, the first objective has got to be defeat of Russia in Ukraine. And that is going to need military support, all the military support that Ukraine requires, including long-range precision missiles such as Tomahawk, but much more besides, with equipment, logistics, support with training and organization. But in addition to that, it requires economic measures, it requires secondary sanctions, it requires Europe to wean itself off its dependence on Russian gas. The fact is that European countries are bankrolling Russia at the moment because of the gas they're buying from Russia, as well as financial measures as well, all designed to put pressure on the regime and force Putin to recognize that he and Russia will never achieve their aims in Ukraine, and force them into a position where they finally recognize President Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian constitution, and Ukraine's right to exist as a sovereign nation.
Mm.
I mean, I appreciate the sentiment, but unfortunately, it doesn't look like that this is going to change on the battlefield. The Russians are taking back territory. They have an advantageous position right now at the tactical level that will translate to a strategic advantage, all while the West is still sort of shuffling about the place. The bottom line is and I maintain this, there needs to be a negotiated settlement to this thing right now. And if that means the Europeans have to take the lead and kind of, get on the same page with Ukraine, whatever it takes. But at this point, the hope that there's going to be some near-term fundamental shift in the war back to Ukraine's favor, I think it's, with all due respect, I think it's delusional. And the longer this war goes on, the more territory Ukraine is going to lose, and the harder it's going to be to preserve the Ukrainian state as an independent sovereign nation, which is the goal. We want Ukraine to go on in some way, which is why negotiated settlement should have been the name of the game the minute Trump was inaugurated. It's not been. And we are now in a position where Russia is resurgent. The sanctions don't work. They're not working. The Russians continue to be able to fight. They're selling their oil and their other resources at breakneck paces. And then you've got the added issue, of course, of, the European economy, notably Germany, which is probably one of the most important European economies, period, has been completely crippled by the loss of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Germany's economic miracle after the Cold War was built upon cheap Russian energy sources. That's been denied to them, and you're now seeing Germany collapse. And in a way, you're seeing the European project collapse as well because of that, or at least falter. So in my opinion, the sooner Europe gets a deal over the Ukraine war and with Russia there, the better for everybody.
I'm afraid any talk of a negotiated settlement is pure fantasy and fails to understand the nature of Russia. Russia wants to remove Ukraine from the map as a sovereign state. Russia wants to build another Russian empire. And the only way that there could be any settlement is when Russia is defeated. And I'm afraid that
I don't think Europe's capable of defeating
negotiated
Russia.
settlement by President Trump were firstly pure acquiescence with Putin's scheme, and secondly total fantasy. Second point I'd make is Ukraine is not losing. Ukraine is fighting and stopping the Russians. Yes, the Russians are making incremental gains, but for the much vaunted Russian military to have failed so completely signally to achieve any real decisive effect demonstrates Ukraine's ability, more than anything else, to hold on. What is required now is Europe to double down. America clearly is going to go its own way, and Europe's got to recognize that. But Europe has to double down and provide Ukraine with the support required to finish the job. And we could do that.
Well, I would not say it's fantasy. I would say that this was something that was very seriously discussed. And then in May, everything sort of fell apart, and it wasn't necessarily the result of any one thing. But to say that the idea of a negotiated settlement is fantasy, we know that the Russians were interested in doing a negotiation back during the Istanbul conference 3 years ago, and that was scuttled.
If you
we
trust,
don't have to get into why or how.
Anybody who trusts Russia is deluding.
It's not a question of trust, sir. I don't trust anybody. I don't even trust our allies. This is the Westphalian state model. It's anarchic. Unfortunately, though, it's a simple matter. It's a simple matter of who has the leverage, who has the juice on the ground. And right now, the Russians have all the leverage.
The only thing that is going to happen if there is a ceasefire forced on Ukraine is that Russia will recover, rebuild, regain, and have another go.
But so would Ukraine
2 years,
and NATO.
5 years.
Okay, I'm going to bring Alexander Mereshko back into this, because I want to drill down onto this a little bit more about what success looks like, because we had talk from the president saying on social media that Ukraine can reclaim back all the territory it's lost. It looks as if maybe he isn't pushing for a quick settlement after all. I mean, so far, as of August this year, Russia has taken control of about 20% of Ukrainian territory. After rapid early advances, Russia's recent progress has been pretty slow. Since about late 2024, the front line, which stretches about 1,000 kilometres, has been largely frozen in place, give or take. So, Dr. Mereshko, I want to ask you and respond to what our other panellists were just talking about as well. But can Ukraine really reclaim its lost territory? I mean, it failed to do so in that highly anticipated summer counteroffensive in 2023. So why can it turn the tables now?
Well, first of all, Russian troops have already bogged down in the territory of Ukraine. Their advances are extremely modest. For the last several years, it was only 1%. And interestingly, Ukrainian troops even managed to reclaim our territories. So we very effectively repel Russian attacks. I have absolutely no doubt that sooner or later, we will manage to restore our territorial integrity in full, and we will return all our temporarily occupied by Russia now territories, including Crimea. It will take patience. Maybe it will take not necessarily by military hand, by political diplomatic means. I don't know how many years it might take, but I'm absolutely certain that sooner or later we will restore our territorial integrity in full. If you look at the history of Russia, you will see that sooner or later, dictatorial regime in Russia will collapse. And it will open a window of opportunity for Ukraine to take back our territories.
Brandon, I can see your face. I can see you want to say something.
Well, I mean, I don't look. The Ukrainians have fought very bravely. There's nobody I know of who will discount that. And Ukraine has been victimized. There's no doubt. But let's get real. The Russians have maintained the territory they held at the beginning of the war, period. So whether they're advancing or they're not advancing, the bottom line is, in my opinion, just looking at it objectively, the basis for a deal is right there. They've held on to the territory they've coveted for years, which is the eastern portion of Ukraine and Crimea. Now, I hear from multiple people in the Ukraine camp who say we're going to take back the territory, and maybe you'll get some inches here and there. But let's get real about Crimea. I mean, do you really believe that Crimea is ever going to be given up by the Russians without, they're talking at one point during the war, they were talking at one point about defending Crimea's territory with nuclear weapons if need be. Now, maybe that was an extravagant comment by Medvedev, but the Russians have made it very clear that Crimea, for them, is the strategic lifeline. And this is what initiated in 2014 the conflict in many respects, was control over Crimea, over Sevastopol. And in fact, we know that, the Russians have long coveted warm water ports. Sevastopol, Tartus, formerly Tartus, Vladivostok, and the facilities they've got on the Baltic Sea are really the only access points they have to warm water ports. And this has been a long-term Russian strategic objective. So when I hear people talking about we're going to get back Crimea, that to me gets a little worrisome because, first of all, it means the war is going to continue on indefinitely, draining more resources and lives. And second of all, I just find it a little difficult to believe that the Russians are going to give that up without going, escalating significantly, which to me is not a good path to take, in my opinion.
General, I'm going to come to you for a response, but Dr. Marechko, just give me your reaction to Brandon's comments.
Yeah, again, look at the history of Russia. In reality, Russia is nothing but a regional empire in decline. Its fate is total disintegration. And sooner or later, it will be, in a couple of years, I might make even this bold prediction, we'll see Russia to continue to disintegrate. And soon, such parts of Russian empire, like, for example, Chechnya, other republics, they will withdraw, they will secede from Russia. Russia will stop to exist as an empire. It's an inevitable process because it cannot function. Look at the map. It's not governable. It can be governed only by terror and repressions, but you cannot govern for forever using terror and repression. So Russian empire is doomed, and they shouldn't even think about Crimea. They should care more about what will be going on within this empire in decline.
I would just say they've been around for a while, and the cult of the Silnaya Ruka reigns strong there, and they have a very long history of autocratic rule. I would be very careful predicting the collapse of Russia permanently. I heard this back in the 90s and definitely the 2000s. I had friends at the Hudson Institute who were briefing, the National Geospatial Intelligence Center and giving these long-winded briefings about, the Russians are going to disintegrate and we'll have the ability to project power into that part of Eurasia. The Russians hear that, by the way, and it makes them become hardened to the West even more than they are, which is probably not the best thing to be doing. I don't think, though, that Russia is going to disintegrate anytime soon, perhaps one day. But I think also the West is in decline, and this is a big problem for all of us, because that's what concerns me more, is the decline of the West and the collapse of our institutions, both here and in other Western countries.
General, let me bring you in here. What's your take on both of those arguments? And also, let me reinstate our first question to you. Can Ukraine actually win back its lost territory when it has failed to do so up until now?
I would say that it cannot do it without the support of Europe in a way which has not yet begun to be delivered. But at the end of the day, clearly, there is a difference, I think, between regaining lost territory and inflicting defeat on Russia. Now, it is up to Ukraine to determine, and of course, it is Ukraine's sovereign right to regain its territory. But I think if the pressure is kept on Russia, if the pressure is ramped up on Russia, if Russia continues to lose legions, huge numbers of its men just chucked into the mincing machine and destroyed, together with really effective economic and financial measures as part, I come back to my point, the need to think strategically about this, and we haven't yet seen that from the West in its support for Ukraine. Dictatorships are by their very nature brittle. When Prigozhin launched his quixotic charge to Moscow, that really hit hard. And that was a tiny pinprick. So dictatorships are brittle, and things can happen very, very quickly. I'm not going to make any predictions about when, but I think the Ukrainians know the Russians well, and I think Dr. Marenshko may be onto something here.
Dr. Marenshko, I want to ask you, just before we move on to our final segment, if the US does look like it's retreating from this quick end to a war, do you think that Ukraine, and by extension Europe, should be prepared for a much longer, drawn-out conflict?
We should be prepared for a marathon in any case, because we should be prepared for the worst-case scenario. And the paradox is, the more prepared we are for a long fight, the bigger chances are that peace will come maybe even unexpectedly and quicker. Yes, we know that we can rely on our European partners, but I don't write off the United States for a very simple reason. United States is not only about the president, it's about society, it's about democratic institutions, it's about the Congress. And majority of congressmen and senators, we continue to enjoy the bipartisan support. So we still believe that the United States remains our closest ally and friend. And luckily, you can see yourself that President Trump's stance is changing. He makes a progress. There is a certain evolution. And the chances are that finally we will manage to persuade him and to stand firmly on the right side of history and on the side of American interests.
General, what do you think? Do you think that if the US is not going to push as hard, perhaps, as it has for a negotiated ceasefire, that Europe needs to be prepared now for a long and drawn-out war on its border?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think, as I said, I think we've sort of been around this boy. I think we have to write off America, because America's decided to go somewhere else and do its own thing and cut loose. I think that, you know, that is for America to determine. That leaves the ball firmly in Europe's court. And the only way, I think, the idea of, as I say, of a negotiated ceasefire is cloud cuckoo land, because Putin will never respect that, and we have to recognize that he will keep going until he achieves what he wants in Ukraine, unless he is stopped dead, and that means defeating Russia in Ukraine, and that means, as I've said again and again, it needs a properly thought through strategy from Europe, with all the means required to give Ukraine the necessary support to achieve that. And that is going to take a long time, potentially, and we need to be in it for the long haul. As it is, don't forget.
And in the meantime, how many Ukrainians are going to be slaughtered?
11 years fighting this war, and this is a long war anyway.
Well, I think that Europe does need to come up with a strategy. I think Europe has had no strategy for 30 years. So it would be nice to hear something actually useful for Europe and the West. Good luck to them. But my ultimate point here is there is no capacity in the West right now that I'm seeing that can beat the Russians in the field. I had a 3-star general tell me at the beginning of the war, I was out in a West Coast facility talking to them about something else, and this came up in the Q&A, and this general told me, "Don't you understand? We're bleeding the Russian army in the field." Well, it looks a lot like actually they've bled U.S. supplies, completely depleted us of those critical supplies. They are draining the coffers of Europe. They're draining Ukraine of young men who should be used to build that economy in Ukraine. So to me, the longer this goes on, it looks like actually we're the ones who are going to lose. And it certainly looks like the longer this goes on, the closer, which is the nightmare scenario, the closer China and Russia become. Because I would point out that historically, Russia and China are not partners naturally, and they only are getting together because of the last several years of the war in Ukraine and all of the pressure we've put on Russia over the war. This is why I believe a negotiated settlement is not fantasy cuckoo land stuff. This is the only option left to us to preserve something of Ukraine, because otherwise the war will drag on. Europe will not be able to commit what they're saying they can commit to. The Americans are not going to continue giving what they've given, no matter what is said publicly. And we're reorienting away from this region anyway, which means the Ukrainians are going to probably be be left on their own, which is not good for anybody. We need to get a deal now, and we need to start the negotiating process, not escalating. And in terms of those Tomahawks, the Tomahawk missile is the key U.S. Weapon that we use for long-range strikes. We've been relying on the same arsenal for several years. Though that arsenal, from what I was told 2 weeks ago, is dangerously depleted, and now people are having conniptions in the Pentagon because now, of course, the Tomahawk is going to be the primary weapon used in this Venezuela strikes we're getting ready to do in the next 3 weeks, which means that that limited source will be drained even more. So unless Europe is somehow going to start mass producing Tomahawks, I don't know what anybody's talking about with Tomahawks going to Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. General, I can see you shaking your head there. What do you want to add?
I think senior political leadership and other opinion formers need to be very careful about swallowing hook, line, and sinker the Russian information operation, which says that Russia is all-powerful, that Russia cannot ever be defeated. I think that is a fantasy. I think it is pure propaganda. And I'm afraid a lot of people who really ought to know better have swallowed it. And they ought to know better.
Well, having lived through 10 years of the Russia collusion scandal here in the United States, I can tell you that a lot of people throw the Russia disinformation moniker at people they disagree with unfairly. I'm not spreading Russian disinformation. I'm telling you what I'm hearing from my sources, of which I have many in the U.S. defense establishment. I'm not telling you what I'm hearing from Russia. I know what Russia's going to say. You know what Russia's going to say. I'm telling you what I'm hearing from people in the U.S. defense establishment, and you're welcome to challenge me on that, but please don't accuse me of being a Russian apologist, which I am not. The Russians killed my extended family in 1945. I have no love for the Russians, okay? I'm just telling you like it is. You're giving me ideology, and it's going to be on Europe to figure out what they're going to do, because I'm giving you a friendly warning that what I'm hearing is there is a reprioritization already underway in the Pentagon away from Europe.
Dr. Mereshko, do you want to respond to any of that before we move on?
Yeah, I would like to emphasize only one point, that what we need most of all, we need weapons, of course, we need sanctions, but most of all, we need leadership, American leadership, because it's a key issue. As for any prospects of negotiations, on the basis of my modest experience of negotiating with Russians, I was a deputy head of the delegation, Ukrainian delegation to the Trilateral Contact Group. It's a Minsk process. I can absolutely confidently state that it makes absolutely no sense to negotiate with Russians. What's the point to negotiate with someone who will sooner or later will break the agreement? It's impossible to reach any agreement with them, and it's impossible to make sure that they will comply with this agreement. So we tried it for years and years, and the result was a full-scale invasion.
General?
Dr. Mereshko is right. You cannot negotiate with Russia. Russia will never give up its intent to remove Ukraine from the map and to incorporate Ukraine in another Russian empire. And I think the sooner senior leadership across Europe and indeed America understand that, then they might think through policy rather more effectively.
Well, another issue.
Point out okay. Sorry.
Go ahead, Brandon.
I was just I reiterate the fact that American leadership for many years, going back to the first Trump term, gave way more to Ukraine, lethal aid, than the Europeans ever did. And so this idea that Americans don't recognize the threat or whatever of Russia, I would say deeds, not words. Our deeds indicated that we were fully supportive of defending Ukraine. We are at the end of our rope, though. And I know Europe says it wants to, take over and contribute, but I don't see any real capability on their end for 30 years. And even you, General, admitted that the Europeans have not, quote, sacrificed, getting ready to fight Russia. I think that there won't be any major sacrifice on the part of Europe. Why would they want to do that? This is not worth their time either, an effort. They have to rebuild their own countries in Europe. There's a lot of problems internally in Europe. So this is an ongoing issue, but it's not going to be resolved by Europe somehow filling the gap of the United States. And the United States simply cannot continue doing what it's doing, not when we've got, as they say down in the South, bigger fish to fry.
Mm-hmm. General, your response?
Well, I agree that the European performance has been pretty pathetic. But that doesn't mean to
has,
say that it
yes.
can't change, and that it must change. And I would also highlight the fact that the war in Ukraine is not just a war in Ukraine. It's a war by Russia on the West. It's a war against Ukraine joining the West. And it is European and indeed it's American security, because if Putin gets what he wants in Ukraine, we can be absolutely certain that he will move on to the Baltic states or elsewhere. And then NATO absolutely is in the mix. So it's incumbent on Europe to provide the support for Ukraine, but also to Europeanize NATO, now that America is no longer a reliable ally, and pick up the standard and run with it.
Well, one of the other issues that we're facing in these recent weeks, I guess, perhaps more so than ever, is the idea or the fear of spillover. Because earlier this month, Russia breached NATO airspace 3 times in just 2 weeks. Russian drones flew into Poland and then Romania, and then a week later, Russian fighter jets crossed into Estonia. When asked about it, the US president unequivocally said his NATO partners should shoot down the offending Russian aircraft. So, General, let's start with you. Is Russia testing NATO resolve with these airspace violations? And what message do you think the Kremlin is trying to send? Is it trying to humiliate NATO? Because they didn't really respond with too much force.
Russia and the Kremlin believe it's been at war with NATO since 2014. And what you're seeing with these probing and overflights and incursions, with the launching of drones against Poland, over Denmark and the like, are all part of Russia testing NATO, probing, looking for weaknesses. And the fact is that 3 weeks ago, when 19 drones were launched against Poland, that was an attack on a NATO ally by Russia. NATO exists to protect the airspace, the sea lines of communication, and the land borders of NATO members. And it failed. NATO deterrence failed. And so NATO now needs to look to itself and build up properly, look at the lessons learned, and build a proper deterrent effect to ensure that Russia recognizes that it cannot do so. And if necessary, I think it absolutely, NATO should be warning Russia that any further incursions by air will result in the aircraft being shot down. And it must be absolutely clear that it's prepared to meet Russia with strength, rather than let Russia get away with believing that it can continue to probe and do what it wants.
But has there been any questioning inside of Brussels or any of these NATO capitals that maybe the reason the Russians are escalating is because for several years we have been pouring all of this lethal aid into Ukraine, and that in their view, this is causing them to escalate against us because they think we're escalating against them and we're now on this escalatory spiral? I mean, it takes 2 to tango here. And in terms of deterrence, I agree, deterrence failed, obviously, because they launched these drones. But to be fair, both the Poles and I believe it was the Norwegians or possibly the Dutch, they both deployed warplanes and immediately knocked those 19 drones out before they posed any threat to any people on the ground. So I agree that, yes, the Russians, the deterrence didn't work, but NATO was able to stop the threat before it became much of a threat. But we do need to kind of start asking ourselves, maybe this is a reaction also to things that we're doing. It's not just one side. And I understand there's going to be an argument about, well, defending themselves, et cetera. But the point here is, in my view, just looking at it objectively, the Russians are escalating because they think we're escalating. So maybe that's the off-ramp for both sides to sit down at a big, beautiful table and start talking so we don't have this escalatory spiral, because that's going to end badly for everybody.
The only way to meet Russia is with strength. Where Russia finds weakness, it probes. It will stick the bayonet in until it finds, and if
I understand that, but if we've depleted ourselves, then we're already weak.
Just let the General finish, Brandon, then I'll come back.
Yes, sorry. No, I apologize. I'm sorry.
Let me finish. The only way to meet Russia is with strength. If Russia finds weakness, it probes. And it is probing. It has been conducting a covert war against Europe. for the last 11 years, and it will continue to do so. Assassinations, arson, espionage, manipulation of minorities, that is the Russian way. And so NATO now needs to absolutely show strength for whatever reason. And actually, generally speaking, in history, where Russia is met with strength, it backs off. And again, that has been the case. And it should be no different this time.
Brandon, your response, and then I'll bring you in, Dr. Maresco.
I don't disagree with what you're saying about probing. This is exactly what Russia does historically. But again, this is not happening in a vacuum. It's not like the Russians just woke up one day and said, we're going to pick a fight with NATO. There are things that occurred in the last 30 years that led to this point. And I think we need to be honest with ourselves in the West, and many of us are not, that it takes two to tango. And so while you're talking about probing, I'm sitting there going, we also, though, weren't sitting around minding our own business. We were doing things to provoke the Russians as well, or the Russians perceived them as provocations, and we didn't do enough to assuage them that this was not a provocation. There's a litany of things we don't have time to get into here that I'm happy to get into them at another point, of all the different things that both we and the Russians did to each other to bring us to this position. But just sitting there saying that we have to be strong when we've just agreed for the last hour or half hour that basically the United States cannot keep up with this current demand on its resources, and the Europeans are not anywhere near ready to start producing their own capabilities to stand up to Russia, to be strong against Russia. So isn't that in a way already inviting the kind of attacks you're talking about? The fact that they know that we are at our logistical end here in the West. This is the problem, and we've put ourselves in this position. And I would remind everybody, this is not the first time we've done this to ourselves in the last 30 years. This happened throughout the Middle East wars, where we would drain ourselves, and then we were delayed being able to get resources where we needed to. Luckily, we didn't have a great power threat at that time, but Russia's a different animal now. It's a great power threat. They've got capabilities on hand that we haven't had to face in 30 years.
Dr. Maresco, what do you think about Europe's response? Do you think it was slightly weak and undecisive, leaving the door open for more provocation, as the general was saying? Should we have seen similar measures to, say, Turkey in 2015 when it shot down the Russian jet? That seemed provocational at the time, but it actually ended up de-escalating the situation. What would Ukraine like to be seeing from its European allies?
Well, if you look at all actions by Putin, you will see very clear, very distinct pattern of behavior, and it's very primitive. Putin is a provocateur. He makes a provocation, and then he sees what happens. If there is no reaction, he goes further. As simple as that. So if you want to cope with him, the best way to do is to respond from position of strength, to respond with resolve and more strongly, because by its nature, Putin is nothing but a schoolyard bully. But as a bully, he's a coward. He's afraid, and each time when the West responds with force and with resolve, Putin stops. As simple as that.
And I would suggest that Trump greeting Putin, an indicted war criminal, on a red carpet in Alaska, effectively just made Putin realize that he can push as hard as he can. And it's no surprise that these incursions and the tempo of these incursions has increased in recent weeks and months.
Well, I would just say that for the last 8 years of the 2 terms, non-consecutive terms of Trump, the president has been extremely consistent in providing lethal aid, much to the chagrin of many people within his own coalition in the United States. So I disagree with you that he's at all exhibited any kind of weakness whatsoever. I think he is exhibiting rationality. We are at the end of the line here with what we could do. And I pray and hope that cooler heads prevail here, because I don't see how this ends well for anybody under current conditions. And Europe's not going to be able to stand up and fill in the gap for several years. I mean, they don't. In my opinion, it's not going to end well for us.
And your president has also been extremely consistent in acquiescing with Trump, siding with Putin, and effectively siding with Putin against his own allies. And he has managed to give two of Putin's most cherished foreign policy objectives to him on a plate. Number one, he has decoupled America from European security. And number two, he is in danger of having held NATO below the waterline by effectively saying that America will not provide a security guarantee for Europe.
Well, most of NATO not paying their end of the defense budget agreement for years, decades, I think sunk NATO long before Donald Trump came along. Again, he just kind of woke everybody up to the reality that we were being taken advantage of in the United States, and he put an end to it, or he's putting an end to it.
And as I agreed with you earlier, Europe should not have allowed itself to be put in a position where it effectively expected America to pay the bills. And of course, that sits with Europe. As you said yourself, it takes two to tango.
And a final word from you, Dr. Merezhko.
Well, I recall that before the full-scale invasion, all intelligence services and their data believed that Ukraine would not be able to survive and would not be able to hold out for more than a week or so. But we've been fighting against Russia for more than 3.5 years. Don't be afraid to beat the evil. Don't be afraid to beat Russia and Putin. You know, all we need solidarity. We can do it, and we will definitely win. Russia cannot win the war, and Ukraine cannot lose the war. But all we need more weaponry, more support, and more sanctions, and we will do it together.
Exactly where that comes from remains to be seen. Gentlemen, this has been another great illuminating debate. I appreciate all your diverse points of view. General Sir Richard Sheriff, thank you for joining us, a former Deputy Supreme Commander of NATO forces. Brandon Wykert, author and Senior National Security Editor at the National Interest, and Ukrainian MP Dr. Alexander Merezhko, Chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Gentlemen, thank you for your time here on Counterpoints.
Thank you.
And as always, thank you to you for tuning in to this episode of Counterpoints. To keep up to date with all of our latest debates and interviews, be sure to subscribe to Al Arabiya English on YouTube, and don't forget to follow us on X and TikTok. We'll see you next time.